grandpa grew up in this little town called Grapefield, Virginia. These days, Grapefield is just 4 streets with a creek running through it, but it used to be a whole lot more. And walk about a mile out of town, past a pair of old logging patches, and you got the Appalachian Trail right there in your figurative doorstep. I used to think growing up in that kind of place would make for an idyllic childhood, with its small-town values, strong sense of community, and the great green forest for a backyard. But there was a reason Grandpa got out of there the first chance he got. They used to say they moved because of the Great Depression, and there might have been at least some truth to that. But if some of the stories Grandpa later told me are anything to go by, it wasn't just money problems that made them want to move. Because although it seems like a quiet and eventful place, Grapefield, Virginia has a real dark past, and some of the folks living there still say it's cursed. Now, back before the Civil War, Grapefield was said to be a prosperous and promising little town where the vast majority of people were employed by one of 2 plantation families who lived at opposite ends of the holler. One family were slave owners and employed white townsfolk as drivers, overseers, tradesmen, and clerks, while the other family were staunch abolitionists and employed all and the same except for their farmhands and technicians were white townsfolk. For the most part, this arrangement worked out just fine for both parties, but as the violence over in Kansas got more and more out of hand, still waters came to a simmer. Before long, the subject of slavery was no longer something that could be discussed politely, and by the time the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, folks in Grapefield weren't using words to settle arguments anymore. They were using bullets. Obviously, the abolitionists had what you might call the moral high ground. The only trouble was, Virginia was a slave state, and the profit margins of the slave-owning side of Grapefield were much higher than those on the abolitionist side, who paid all their people good and fairly. But then, this meant the slave owners had mountains of cash lying around, cash they could use to hire all kinds of unsavory types to protect them from the abolitionists, and that protection usually involved violence, intimidation, and occasionally murder. Some of the abolitionists tried to fight back, but seeing as they were outnumbered and outgunned, most ended up hanging from their barns, and anyone with any sense fled for northern states before they could be targeted. This would have all worked out just fine for the slave owners if it wasn't for the fact that the Graybacks would go on to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And once the Federals arrived in town, the slave owners had to parlay their way back into ownership of their own plantation. Somehow, they managed to do just that, only this time, they couldn't rely on free labor, and there were no more abolitionist farmers in town to help maintain the plantation. They had all the expertise they needed, just none of the manpower, and although they shipped in folks from out of town to try and fill the gaps, things were never quite the same as they were before. Before the war, the head of the slave-holding plantation family had been cruel and conniving, but he was at least competent. But then his replacement, his eldest surviving son, was a fool, a tyrant, and a drunk. He might not have owned slaves anymore, but he sure did treat his people like they were. And he didn't just treat them like his property. He treated their homes and their families like they were his property too. The new plantation owner always was a little too fresh with Grapefield's womenfolk, but then one night, after a man's wife returned home claiming the plantation owner had violated her, the townsfolk decided that enough was enough. A whole mob of them marched over to the plantation house, but instead of dragging the owner outside and hanging him from his own porch, the mob started going around nailing doors and windows closed. Anyone who tried to escape was shot, and there were lots of folks in there too, not just the plantation owner and his family. They had maids, cooks, nannies for the children, all of whom learned to stay away from the doors or windows, lest they face a hail of bullets. Once they had the plantation house locked down, the mob doused the place and set it on fire. The mob were liquored up, and they clapped and cheered as the plantation house burned, but that all stopped when they started to hear the screams of the women and children upstairs. It was then and only then that they realized what a terrible thing they'd done. One man tried to pry the nails out of one of the window frames in hopes that he might be able to rescue some of the women and children, but it was too late. There was no way back for them. They couldn't have any witnesses to attest to what they'd done. The whole thing needed to look as much like an accident as possible, not so much for their consciences, but for appearances. No one could ever know the truth of what happened that night. Well, you can see how well that went. The mob must have done a decent job enough of covering things when it came to the authorities, because no one was hanged for burning down the plantation house. But I guess at some point, someone talked, either to their wife or to a minister, maybe even to their deathbed, because once word got out that the fire was no accident, it was like a darkness seeped into Grapefield, one that never went away. The town's economy was completely torn apart. Fear and suspicion became the norm. It took 40 years for the place to even start to heal, but even after things started to pick up again, folks talked of a curse hanging over the town. All that guilt meant a lot of drinking, and all that drinking meant a lot of broken homes, a lot of anguish, and a lot of misery too. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the kind of town my grandpa grew up in, far from the kind of Hallmark card upbringing that I imagined he had. As you can probably tell, Grandpa talked an awful lot about growing up in Grapefield, probably in an attempt to instill gratitude in myself and his other grandchildren. I can promise you it worked. Because as much as my grandpa had 101 stories from his childhood that'd make you laugh your butt off, he had one or two extremely creepy ones too. He wouldn't tell them often, and he didn't tell us any scary stories when we were kids, but once I was old enough and I happened to be picking his brain one dark October evening, he told me one story I'll remember for as long as I live. It all started when a hunter named Hiram Carter walked back into town one day after spending all morning sitting in his blind out in the woods. This was back in 1934, just after Prohibition ended, and someone had set up a little speakeasy kind of joint over on Apple Lane. Hiram walked straight into the speakeasy, drank a whole bottle of beer in 4 or 5 gulps, and chased it down with a double shot of whiskey. Then, when both bottle and glass were empty, Hiram asked for another round. Obviously, a man doesn't drink like that unless something very good has happened, or something very, very bad has happened. So naturally, Hiram's fellow patrons were pretty keen to know what the occasion was. But Hiram didn't have any good news to share. In fact, he was more frightened than he'd ever been in his whole life. He'd been sitting in his blind, which, for those that don't know, is basically like a camouflaged shelter that hunters hide in. And Hiram's there for hours before anything comes along, but sure enough, he starts seeing this big old buck walking through the trees towards him. It's still some distance away, so Hiram's got to wait as it gets closer and closer so he can get the perfect shot. He's got that buck trained in his sights. He's steadying his breathing. Then something spooks the deer, and it goes bolting off through the woods. Hiram lowers his rifle, trying to spot whatever it was that spooked his deer. Then suddenly, he sees it. Something darts through the trees in front of him, too skinny to be a bear, too big to be a dog, and it's moving so fast that it just about scared Hiram half to death. He stays put in his hide for a few minutes, clutching his rifle with sweaty palms, and then he rushes out of his hide back to his truck and drives all the way back into town as fast as the engine could handle. He said that whatever it was stalking him all the way back to his vehicle. It stayed just out of sight, but it was there, following him, and Hiram said it just about frightened the life out of him. The boys down at the speakeasy told him it was probably just some coyote or a mangy bear that didn't get enough food before hibernating. But Hiram said he was certain about what he saw, and he hadn't seen nothing like it before in his life. It was big, it was fast, and most importantly, it seemed smart. After finishing his drinks, Hiram walked out of the speakeasy and made his way home, but not before warning every man in there to stay the hell out of the woods. Something was out there, and it was dangerous. When word got around about Hiram's encounter out in the woods, some folks took it with a pinch of salt, while the rest took it with a whole shaker. See, Hiram was in the habit of telling tall tales after a few whiskeys. In fact, The only reason he was hunting in the first place was so he could spend half his grocery money on booze. Having the reputation that he did, no one took Hiram's claims all that seriously and went about their business as usual. But just 7 days later, Hiram's story was the talk of town, and unlike the week prior, they took his claims much more seriously. By the time my grandpa was a boy, the site of the old plantation house, the one that had been burned down by the townsfolk, had been abandoned and overgrown for almost 50 years. With no heirs to inherit the property, the land had fallen under the temporary ownership of Bland County's controller, whose only task was to find the property a buyer. But then, in the 40-plus years it had been up for sale, the county hadn't been able to find one. Even the carpetbaggers from up in New York and Chicago wanted nothing to do with it. They'd roll through in their fancy stagecoaches and top hats, take one look at the land and the folks living on it and say, "Thanks, but no thanks." As a result, the land was all waist-high grass, wildflowers, and cypress trees, surrounding the brick foundations of the old plantation house. Local kids were warned to stay away from the place, but I guess kids back then were no different than kids today because they ignored their parents' warnings completely. I guess on account of how mysterious and spooky it was, but kids around my grandpa's age, so about 10 or 11, would often sneak up to the old plantation to explore the grounds. My grandpa said that he went up there once or twice himself, but that he was always getting a bad feeling whenever he was near that place. He'd heard the stories, everyone had, about the plantation being haunted, about the town being cursed. It just wasn't enough to keep the kids away. And for one little girl, ignoring those warnings almost cost her life. One day, a little girl came running back into town with her even younger sister in tow, and they were both out of their poor little minds with fright. They'd been taking their beagle pup out for some exercise and decided to take it onto the old plantation grounds to run him around a little. They were there for no more than a few minutes before their dog suddenly tucked its tail between its legs and started to growl. The older girl gave the dog's leash a tug, and it was only too happy to get the hell away from that creepy old place. But then, as they're walking, the older of the two girls see something moving in the trees surrounding the old plantation, something that scared the living hell out of her, something she later described as a monster. Later, she was safe and a little calmer. The older girl was asked for more details on what she'd seen. She said that the monster had been creeping through the trees on all fours at first, but when it saw her, it raised itself up on its hind legs to watch her from across the clearing. Then, when she and her sister started to run back towards Grapefield, the thing in the tree line dropped back on all four legs again, then started running in their direction like it was trying to cut them off. The two girls ran as fast as their legs could carry them, with their dog doubling back every so often to bark up a storm in the hopes of protecting his owners. Thankfully, the girls managed to make it into town before whatever it was caught up with them, but when they arrived, they were sobbing something fierce. The older of the two girls said the creature was huge, with shaggy hair all over its body, but none at all around its muzzle, which appeared horribly misshapen and deformed. This time, people took the claims much more seriously, but they still thought that it must have been some kind of mangy bear that had attacked the girls. After their hibernation period, if a bear can't find itself a snack in quick enough time, they can get really hungry, and you better believe that a hungry bear is a very dangerous bear as well. And having something raid a few chicken coops or butcher a few hogs, that was one thing, but having the thing hunting the town's children, that could not be tolerated. The most accomplished hunter in Grapefield, a man named Rufus Robinson, volunteered to head out into the woods with his Australian shepherd. He'd said he'd come back with the beast's head, or he wouldn't be back at all. Well, a few days later, Rufus's Aussie shepherd came hobbling back into town all on its lonesome. It walked right over to Rufus's cabin, but then instead of sitting on his porch, the dog went and laid down on his neighbor's, almost like it knew that Rufus wasn't coming home. Folks said Rufus's dog might have run ahead, gotten itself lost, then simply walked back home to wait for his master. He'll be back in a few days, they said. Ain't no mangy bear got the better of old Rufus. But Rufus never came back with no mangy bear's head. In fact, Rufus Robinson never came back at all. And there was no sending a search party in after him unless its first and foremost task was hunting down the bear that took him. And that's when the townsfolk formed a hunting party, 6 of their best men that'd head out into the woods with shotguns and rifles and bring home Rufus's body and end the threat that mangy bear posed once and for all. Well, according to a member of the hunting party, they were out there for less than 24 hours before they found the thing that had been stalking the town's children, and it wasn't no bear. One night they set up a real simple trap, just laid some fresh meat as bait out in the open, then all they had to do was wait. Well, they waited, and they waited, but nothing showed. Then just when someone gets up to collect the meat so they can move it someplace else, bingo, the thing comes tearing through the trees and attacks the man who approached the meat. It almost took a chunk of his arm before he managed to stick a knife in the thing, then once he was free of its grip, his hunting buddies emptied almost every shell they had into it, and they didn't stop firing until the beast stopped moving. Once they were quite certain the thing was dead, the hunters approached, shining their lanterns on the creature to get a better look. Only then did they realize what they were looking at. It wasn't any kind of bear. It was a man. His hair and beard were long and shaggy, his unclothed body so filthy in parts that the dirt and mud appeared as a second kind of skin. Wherever there was bare skin, such as his face, his chest, and his shoulders, there were hideous webs of burn scars, so much so that the man beneath had been robbed of his human appearance. His spine was arched and contorted, his hands and feet bore heavy calluses, and at the ends of long bony fingers sprouted sharp, filth-encrusted claws. Obviously, none of the men had ever seen anything quite like it, so they dragged the man's body out of the woods, then woke up the town's doctor to come inspect their quarry. Now, this doctor had been Grapefield's resident physician for the better part of 50 years. He treated everyone in town that had lived there since the 1870s, including the old plantation owner and his family. It was him that realized who the man was, why he was covered in burn scars, and why he'd been living like a wild animal for what must have been decades. It was one of the plantation owner's sons. Back on the night of the plantation house being burned down, the mob encircled the building to make sure no one could escape. They took shots at anyone who came near the windows or doors, at least all except one. The plantation house was huge, so the dozen or so men that made up the mob had to space themselves out real wide to cover all the angles. One man, stationed just off the east wing, sees someone scrambling out of a small cellar grate. He raised his rifle, got ready to fire, but then saw it was just a boy, his skin all scorched and blistering, and he didn't have it in him to execute a child. Besides, he was so burned up that there was no way that he'd survive more than a day or two out there in the woods all alone. So instead of filling him full of lead, like they did with the others who tried to escape, the man let the boy go, having no idea that in decades to come, his decision would come back to quite literally haunt them. No one knows how the boy survived out in the woods for so long or why he'd chosen to live out in the trails of Appalachia instead of trying to settle down any place. Most suspect that the grief of losing his whole family so suddenly drove him insane, and that fear of mankind kept him living in the woods like some type of animal. But there are a few who agree on how he came to look the way he did. Obviously, the scars were present all over his body, being from the fire. But what wasn't so clear was how the boy had come to be so comfortable running on all fours like some type of dog. Some said that he must have been born that way, and his appearance was probably why he couldn't settle down anywhere. They figured that since he got treated like a monster, he started acting like one too. But others said that he was perfectly healthy, and that in slowly losing his humanity, he learned to run and hunt like an animal. Honestly, I don't know what to make of any of this, and neither did my grandpa. He always thought it was some myth or legend, until his own ma and pa confirmed that it was indeed the truth. They said that the boy's death was just another in a long line of murders that never saw justice. and since they couldn't stand another one, they decided to move. Grandpa raised the point that it couldn't have been murder if the hunters were just defending themselves, and his pa responded with what I think are some wise words. He said that the boy never really survived the plantation fire that night, how he was probably wandering around the woods living like an animal, never truly being a person. Whether he came back to Grapefield for revenge or just to revisit the place he grew up, killing him meant finishing off a murder that started 30 or 40 years earlier, and that's why people say the town is cursed. Not because there's some evil spirit lurking around the place, but because those who came before condemned those who came after to have all the same blood on their hands. I want to tell you a little story about a pretty Appalachian girl named Willa Mae Martin, or as we call her around here, the girl who married a corpse. Willa Mae lived with her husband in a place called Clinch Valley over in eastern Tennessee. They were a young couple, married at 17 in a shotgun wedding once Willa Mae realized that she was pregnant. They moved into a small rural home together, and for at least a little while they were happy. But tragically, around halfway through the pregnancy, Willa Mae lost the baby, and unfair as it was, Alden, her husband, never forgave her for it. He blamed Willa Mae for the miscarriage, saying she didn't take care of herself properly, and accused her of not loving him anymore. He couldn't deal with the grief, so he drank, and when he drank, he beat Willa Mae something terrible. And after a while, the only thing Willa Mae liked about her husband was the fact that he worked as an oil driller down in Texas. That meant that he worked 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, which for Willa Mae meant 2 weeks of heaven, followed by 2 weeks of hell. Whenever he was away, Alden asked his brother, Silas Martin, to check in on his wife every so often to keep an eye on her. He did as he asked, stopping by once a month or so to do all the man's work around the home. But after a while, Silas, who was unmarried, began to wonder why Willa Mae had such a melancholy about her. He talked to her sometimes and asked her questions, and when Willa Mae realized that he was genuinely curious about her and wasn't her husband's spy, she broke down and told him everything. How he beat her, how he berated her, how her life was barely worth living. Silas did his best to comfort poor Willa Mae, and then one thing led to another and they ended up falling in love. They tried not to act on it for as long as they could, but while spirits were strong, their flesh was weak. After violating the sanctity of marriage, the clandestine couple knew they couldn't continue their affair in secret. Willa Mae had to do the right thing and break off her marriage to Alden. She waited until Alden went on down to Texas to work for 2 weeks, and then after spending a few days packing up her things and planning her escape with her new beau, Willa Mae sat down to write Alden a letter. Word has it, she gave him both barrels in that old letter of hers, told him what a piece of trash he was, how she'd never really loved him, and how she'd see him in hell. She then grabbed her bags, then rode a wagon all the way to Bean Station just over 12 miles away. When Willa Mae arrived at Bean Station, she found Silas waiting for her. There was just one problem. Silas couldn't collect the last of his wages until the next day, at which point they'd have enough money to survive on for a while once they'd made it to California. Silas put Willa Mae up in a cheap hotel, then said that he'd meet her at the train station the very next morning with all the cash they needed to start a new life together. The next morning, Willa Mae got up, got dressed, then headed to the station to meet Silas. When she arrived, she saw him waiting on the platform for her, wearing his favorite felt hat and jacket. But as she got closer and the figure turned, she saw it was not Silas Martin at all, but rather her husband, Alden Martin, wearing her brother's clothes. You see, Alden had arrived in Texas to begin his 2 weeks of work only to find his services were no longer required. He could come back in 2 weeks and try his luck then, but for the time being, he'd have to head back up to Appalachia and try to make do with what he had saved. Alden then caught an overnight train back up to Tennessee, then caught another to Bean Station, arriving back in town just hours after Willa May did. But while she was up in that hotel room, dreaming of life married to Silas, Alden was back home, reading the Both Barrels letter that she'd written just the night before. The only trouble was, and under the assumption her husband wouldn't return for a full 11 days, Willa May told him exactly what she and his brother were planning to do, along with exactly when she was planning to do it, because, after all, why not? And by the time he read it, she and Silas would be safely in California, a detail she'd completely omitted from her letter. Alden lifted his brother's felt jacket, showing the gun tucked in his breeches, and told her he'd spare her life if she rode to his brother's house with him for a heartfelt apology. Alden gave his wife's bags to a wagon courier and arranged for their delivery back home. He then pulled her atop his horse, and then both rode out to Silas's home. On the approach, when her lover's home came into view, Willa May tried jumping from her husband's horse. She didn't want to see what he'd brought her to see. She screamed, cried, and bucked, but Alden was stronger. He dragged her to the yard outside his brother's home, then forced his hysterical wife to gaze upon the body of her lover as it hung by the neck from the beams of his porch. Before he let Willa May go, Alden told her, "Go. And remember, you did this, not me." He then rode back into Bean Station and handed himself in to the sheriff. Alden told deputies exactly where they could find his brother's body, and that since Silas was orphaned and unmarried, there was no one they needed to inform. But when the deputies went to collect, it was gone, and there was no sign of Willa May. The lady herself was never seen again, and Silas Martin's body remained missing until the night after his brother's hanging, when someone abandoned a cart in front of the sheriff's office. The next morning, someone pulled back a sheet to see what it contained and saw Silas Martin's body lying there, embalmed and pristine, with a wedding band wrapped around one of his cold, dead fingers. The regions surrounding the fabled Appalachian Mountains are home to some fascinating but often macabre myths and legends. Many are already familiar with the likes of the Mothman, the red-eyed harbinger of doom who lurks at the locations of impending disasters, or the Flatwoods Monster, who many believe is an example of extraterrestrial visitation. Yet fewer are familiar with another Appalachian legend, which, after some research, might just be rooted in a very unsettling truth. In certain parts of southern and eastern Appalachia, some folks still talk of an eerie, nocturnal race of imp-like humanoids known as the Moon-Eyed People. The Moon-Eyed People are said to be around 4 foot high, with pale, ghostly bodies and large, slightly bulbous eyes. They're mostly harmless, and only ever come out at night due to their general fear of humanity. But go walking on the trails where the moon is big and bright, and you might just spot a moon-eyed person bathed in silvery light. To most, the Moon-Eyed People sound like nothing but a quaint rural folktale. But like many so-called myths and legends, there can be varying degrees of truth to them, and in the case of nocturnal gnomes, that degree of truth might be very large indeed. Prior to the removal of 1838, North Georgia and other parts of the Appalachians were still part of the Cherokee Nation, and in 1782, the region's governor was a man named John Sevier. That same year, Sevier paid a visit to the Cherokee chief Oconostota at Fort Mountain, who had recently reached the ripe old age of 90 years old. Given his status as the region's governor, Sevier and Oconostota dedicated a great deal of their discussion to local politics. Sevier sought the old chief's wisdom, yet he also sought his experience, and before long, the conversation turned to history. Sevier and Oconostota began discussing the origins of the Cherokee, with the old chief describing how his people had migrated to Appalachia from the northern Great Lakes region. Oconostota claimed his ancestors had arrived to find another people had settled the area, a people so sophisticated that they turned the mountain into a veritable fortress, hence why it was given the name. The Cherokee fought hard to conquer the indigenous tribe, but eventually they prevailed and drove their enemy from the region before settling it themselves. Sevier then asked the old chief if he knew anything of the vanquished tribe. What he was told shocked him deeply. Chief Okonestota's forefathers told him that those who had occupied Fort Mountain before the Cherokee were, and I quote, white men from across the Great Sea. The chief went on to describe how these moon-eyed people earned their name. Not only did they have huge disc-like eyes, much larger than any humans, but they'd evolved to be viciously effective nocturnal hunters, with natural night vision so strong that it struck fear into the hearts of the Cherokee, who didn't dare venture away from their camps after dark. Governor Sevier was stunned and assumed that these Caucasoid tribespeople were merely the stuff of legend, yet Chief Okonestota assured him that his account was no mere myth. Sevier promised to return the following spring and in the company of a historian, so that the chief's account could be officially recorded. Yet sadly, when Sevier returned in the spring of 1783, he discovered that the elderly chief had passed away. Despite Chief Okonestota's death, rumors of the moon-eyed people did not abate. In fact, almost every band of Appalachian Cherokee were familiar with the legends, so much so that it attracted the attention of a man named Benjamin Smith Barton. Born in 1766 in the British colony of Pennsylvania, Dr. Barton was one of the early United States' most prominent physicians. He'd studied at the Philadelphia School of Medicine, but also at Scotland's University of Edinburgh and Germany's University of Göttingen. He was also such a famous and well-respected figure that he'd received honorary diplomas from both the Lisbon Academy and Kiel University. At one time, Dr. Barton specialized in botany, and after corresponding with naturalists throughout the United States and Europe, he published the first American textbook on the subject. Yet around the end of the 18th century, Barton became fascinated with the subject of anthropology and, more specifically, the origins of humanity. After many years of study, Dr. Barton published his 1797 book, New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of America. The book includes excerpts of an interview with a U.S. Army colonel named Leonard Marbury. Fluent in the Cherokee language, Colonel Marbury acted as an intermediary between the government and the natives for the better part of 20 years, and in that time had heard many a story regarding the so-called moon-eyed people. The Cherokee tell us that when they first arrived in the country which they inhabit, they found it possessed by a certain moon-eyed people, Colonel Marbury explained. These wretched people could not see in the daytime and were expelled following a brief but bloody war. At first, Dr. Barton theorized that there had been some kind of miscommunication and that these pale moon-eyed people were not some previously undiscovered race of stunted humanoids, but rather a collection of French settlers. The Cherokee had sometimes described the moon-eyed people as possessing what they described as alien or unfamiliar weaponry. Yet when Dr. Barton interviewed one frequent visitor to the Cherokee, he claimed these alien weapons were little more than hoes, axes, guns, and other metallic utensils that had been brought to the New World by the French. Many others have supported this assertion, claiming the moon-eyed people were no more than rogue European settlers who specialized in hunting by night rather than by day. Yet when South Carolina historian B.R. Carroll interviewed merchant explorer James Adair, he refuted any and all claims that the moon-eyed people were European. Born in the Irish county of Antrim in 1709, Adair sailed to the New World with a British trade mission at the age of 26. He spent the next 40 years living among the natives, chiefly among the Chickasaw and eastern Choctaw, while being almost entirely cut off from the outside world. In 1775, when Adair was in his 60s, he was encouraged to pen an account of his experiences with the native tribes, titling the book A History of the American Indians. The book cemented Adair's status as one of the most knowledgeable Indian experts of his generation, hence why he was sought out by the author B.R. Carroll, and when asked if he was familiar with the so-called moon-eyed people, he replied in the affirmative. Adair claimed that almost all of the Appalachian tribes had stories concerning this primordial race of albino humanoids, but it was not the frequency with which he encountered these stories that convinced Adair of their veracity. It was the consistency with which they were described. Each and every tribe spoke of the moon-eyed people being stunted, nocturnal, and incredibly pale. And what's more, most tribes agreed that the cause of their malformation was that they chose to live underground. Scientifically speaking, the moon-eyed people's wide-eyed physiognomy is entirely consistent with an offshoot of humanity having taken to living underground, especially if they've done so for thousands upon thousands of years. And while this all might sound like the stuff of science fiction, it is firmly rooted in truth. Back in 2003, a team comprised of local and Australian archaeologists began excavating in an Indonesian cave known as Liang Bua, in the hopes of uncovering pre-modern human remains. 2 years later, the team was undertaking a routine dig when they discovered evidence of a human skull. When a section of this skull was sent away for analysis, an Indonesian scientist believed that, due to its relatively small dimensions, the skull must have belonged to a child. Yet after more of the person's skull was uncovered and analyzed, it was discovered that their teeth were that of a full-grown adult. The remains they discovered were not those of a Homo sapien. They belonged to a previously undiscovered relative, Homo florenziensis. Named after the island of Flores on which they were found, Homo florenziensis were determined to be an extinct species of small archaic human that inhabited the island until the arrival of modern humans about 50,000 years ago. The remains found in the Liang Bua cave belonged to an adult female, believed to have stood at 3 foot 7 inches tall, which earned her the nickname the Little Lady of Flores. If the Cherokee did indeed migrate to Appalachia around 12,000 years ago, which is when the last of the Flores Hobbit people are believed to have died out, it's frighteningly feasible that they encountered a prehistoric race of subhuman cave dwellers against whom they waged a terrible and ultimately genocidal war. But then again, how could the Cherokee be so certain that every last one of the moon-eyed people were extinct? Perhaps they simply took shelter in the deepest recesses of their subterranean settlements and became even more cautious following the arrival of European settlers. Maybe the stories of stunted, ethereal-looking beings roaming the Appalachian Trail aren't just stories, but rather an aspect of ancient anthropology that we have yet to fully explain. After all, if the Little Lady of Flores and her kin were only discovered in 2003, what else has mankind yet to discover regarding our ancient and mysterious origins? About 10 years ago, an old college buddy and I had the bright idea of hiking the eastern Tennessee section of the Appalachian Trail. We weren't too hardcore about it or anything. We just took things at our own pace and stopped at grocery stores and diners whenever we could to stock up on home comforts. At one point, we stopped in a town in Hancock County, intending to pick up a few six-packs and maybe a bottle of Jack since we were in his home state. Anyone who's from there will find that hilarious because they'll know what we didn't walking into town, and that's how there isn't a drop of alcohol for sale in that whole goddamn county. We'd managed to stop in a dry town, meaning we had access to all the snacks but none of the booze. And while we were at the store, the nice lady behind the counter said that we'd have to walk to the next county if we wanted to buy any alcohol. But she also said that if we asked someone real nice, they might be able to pick some up for us if they were already out of town. We asked around town for a while, approaching anyone who looked approachable, but while everyone was real nice, no one was able to help us out. We were just about ready to give up, and we were walking back the way we came when we suddenly see this dude walking out of the general store toward what we assumed was his truck. He looked to be around our age, so maybe 25 to 30, and he sure looked like he enjoyed a drink. So me and my buddy decided to ask him if he could give us a ride or something, and we pick him up a few beers as a thank you. So we walk up, introduce ourselves, and then make our proposal. The guy seems friendly enough and didn't seem too keen on giving us a ride until we mentioned buying him a few drinks out of gratitude. After that, he invited us into his truck and we took off in the direction of the next county over, which was the home of the nearest liquor store. We were making some small talk with this guy, just about how the hike was going and stuff like that, when we got to talking about how long the ride would be. He said that it'd be about an hour there and back if we wanted to carry on hiking where we'd left off, at which point we'd have lost all of our daylight and finding a place to camp would be a real pain in the butt. We mentioned this to him and he seemed to have a sort of flash of inspiration. He knew of another place we could buy booze, but seeing as it was a dry county, it wasn't strictly legal either. He asked if we were cops and we laughed when we said no. And he then asked if we were okay buying shine instead of just beer. Now at this point I should explain why this got us so excited. By shine, the guy obviously meant moonshine, which was something we talked about at length before we even stepped on the trails. Sipping beers and whiskeys around a campfire was one thing, but getting our hands on some genuine homemade moonshine would just about be the coolest thing ever. If you went to Oktoberfest in Germany, you'd want some genuine Weissbrau to wash down that bratwurst, right? And if you were vacationing on some Caribbean island, anyone in their right mind would couple that with a good, locally made rum. So the fact that we were in the middle of moonshine country, we were just about ready to jump at the chance to enjoy some genuine, locally made liquor, because when in Rome, you know? And that's why when this dude said that he'd drive us over to his buddy's place, a total stranger, to buy moonshine, we just kind of said, okay, cool. Anyway, the guy changes course a little, and we're totally under the impression that we're going to pull up to some house, we're going to give him some cash, and then he's going to go inside, get us our shine, and then off we go. But then, when we arrived at the place where he was taking us, it didn't look like anyone's house at all. In fact, we recognized what the place was almost instantly. The building itself almost looked like a community center or something. Definitely not a house, and way bigger than most that we'd seen out in those parts, too. But the thing that really clued us in to what we were looking at was the big row of motorcycles outside. My little brother was a big Sons of Anarchy fan at the time, like he had all the box sets and was almost constantly watching it on the big TV downstairs in our house, so right away I knew what I was looking at. We were at a motorcycle club's clubhouse. It was pretty awesome seeing this actual clubhouse right there in front of us, but it was like being at the zoo or something. We were still under the impression that our new friend would just go in and buy the shine for us while we got to sit in the truck. So when he got out of the truck and told us to follow him inside, we both are like, are you sure about that? I'm not going to object to strangers in their clubhouse? But our new friend said no, it'd be fine, and they wouldn't mind at all so long as we were respectful, etc. And so, in we went. And while there wasn't any kind of branding on the outside of the building, the inside was totally different. They had the name of their club everywhere, and while I'm not about to reveal what that was for reasons that'll become obvious, they sure did like their branding. They had all kinds of memorabilia all over the walls, pictures and antiques and stuff, and I mean, it'd be pretty cool of an experience walking into a bar like that if it wasn't for the record scratch moment when we walked in. The second we walked in, all these big, hairy biker dudes just stop what they're doing and turn to look at us. Our new friend asks if the prez is around, which I'm assuming means the club's president. And when told that he was in his office, our new buddy tells us to take a seat at the bar. We do as we're told, but no one comes to serve us drinks or anything. There's just all these dudes and a few chicks standing around, looking at us like, what the hell are you two thinking about walking into a place like this? Our new buddy walked off down a hallway, then after knocking on what must have been the door to the president's office, he walks inside and disappears. Both my buddy and I aren't saying a word, but we're looking at each other like, this is a really bad idea. Everyone in there is giving us death stares, and I even said to one guy, like, the guy said it would be fine, and he says nothing to me in reply. Just grips a pool cue like he's imagining it's my neck and carries on staring at me. I was right on the verge of just being like, we'll just go ahead and wait outside, sorry for the intrusion, when we suddenly heard yelling coming from down the hall. So loud we could hear it over the heavy metal music playing on their in-house PA system. We heard yelling, then some kind of crashing, then our new buddy flies into the hallway with this huge, fat, bald dude following quickly behind. The big dude kicked his butt the entire way down the hallway, stomping him at first, but then dragging him to his feet and smacking him around while screaming all kinds of stuff like, "You dumb POS, are you trying to get us busted? You bring them in here and expect us to I should drag you back and blow your head off, you rat." And my buddy and I get off our bar stools and head towards the way we came in. But another biker dude stands in our way and is like, "You two aren't going anywhere." So right then, in my head, I'm thinking that our new buddy had walked into the office, announced that he'd brought two strangers to the clubhouse to buy moonshine, and the club's president had freaked out on him. We knew it had been a risky move to just walk in and ask, but we also figured our new friend was connected enough for that not to be a problem. Otherwise, why bother risking it in the first place? But then apparently, the president had not taken it well, and it seemed it was us that were about to pay the price too. So as I said, one of the other bikers had stepped in our way and wouldn't let us leave, right? So we just had to stand there and watch our new friend getting smacked around until he finally turned his attentions to my buddy and I. And right away, I start saying things like, "We're so sorry, we had no idea. He told us it was cool, we didn't know," and all this other stuff. But then instead of just beating us right there, the president points towards the door and tells us both, "Get the F out." I remember feeling relief at first, like this sort of lucky, relieved feeling at the idea that he was just going to let us go. But then, at the same time, I'm not the kind of person to just walk off and leave someone in trouble, and neither was my friend. Every fiber of my being wanted to just walk out of that door, run like hell. But there was also this voice in my head saying, "If you just leave that guy here, after he put his butt on the line to get you booze, you are the lowest form of scumbag imaginable." I still feel like that might hold true. It's just that that's not what happened at all. So the big biker guy stepped out of our way so we could leave, but then I say, "What about our friend there? What's going to happen to him?" And the president says, "He's not your friend." I'm still very much in the dark, so I try appealing to the guy's conscience or whatever, telling him he was just trying to help us. But the president yells back, "Help you? He was robbing you. Now get out of here while you still have a chance." And I couldn't believe it. Well, at the time I couldn't, but now it obviously makes way more sense to me. But what I still can't get my head around is the fact that those bikers kinda had our back in a way. I guess when the president was asking something like, "Are you trying to get us busted?" he didn't mean that we might be undercover cops or whatever. He meant that robbing and maybe even killing us would bring way more heat down on them than just selling a little moonshine so they could pay to patch the leaks in the clubhouse roof or something. But anyway, once we realized our new friend was in fact out to get us, we dropped him like a live hand grenade and then got the hell out of there just like the president had told us. A few years back, I was hiking the Appalachian Trail with a few friends of mine, and we ended up stopping at a campsite that had comfort stations and all of that. One night I woke up at around 2 in the morning and needed to use the bathroom. The site was one of those corner sites, so there was a really short trail at the back of the site which led through the woods before you get to the lights where the washroom is. I guess I could have gone around the front, but I figured that I would just cut through there like I usually do to save time because I was tired and needed to pee real bad. So as I'm passing the middle of the trail, I hear a very faint noise coming from my right, something that sounded almost like laughing. I didn't freak out or anything. Like I know raccoons and porcupines make something like a sort of tee-hee-hee sound at night, and I couldn't see anything like a raccoon or a porcupine, but it was dark, so why would I? I just kept going towards the comfort station without a second thought, but then a few seconds later I hear a voice deep in the woods, a woman's voice asking, "Hello?" To say I jumped was an understatement. But then, I was just startled, Not scared at all, but I also didn't know what to say in response, or if this girl was talking to me or someone else entirely. I ended up just saying, "Hey," in a sort of friendly voice, because if some girl was freaking out hearing footsteps in the middle of the night, I didn't want her to think that I was some kind of creeper. But then after I said hey and there was no response, and that's the point that I started to get a little bit freaked out. Once I was at the comfort station, I did my business and managed to talk myself out of having a serious case of the creeps. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, and I still don't, to be honest, and although the timing and sudden silence had been fairly creepy, I knew that worst case scenario, it was just a person that was probably as spooked as I was. Anyway, so I started heading back the way I came, thinking, if I heard anything this time, I'm just going to sprint. But I'm getting further and further along the trail, and it's as quiet as the grave out there. I'm maybe 75% of the way along the trail, thinking to myself, I hope I didn't scare that girl too bad, when I hear her voice again. Only it's not her voice. It just sounded like her voice, but it was different in a way that made my skin want to crawl right off my body when it said, "Come back." And I think that was the fastest I've ever ran in my entire life. I beat feet like an athlete and threw myself back into my tent so frantically that I woke everybody up. They kept asking what was wrong, and all I could say was, I think I just freaked myself out is all. There was no way in hell they'd believe me if I told them what I'd heard. They'd think that I was drunk, high, or just a little baby man, or maybe a little of all three. But they would not believe that I heard a voice change in a way that it did. It sounds crazy, but I actually hoped that they would hear it at some point, but we moved campgrounds that next day and I didn't hear anything like it for the whole rest of the trip. I'm obviously very glad that's the case. I just wish that I knew what I heard that night, because I'd be lying if I said that question didn't keep me up at night. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, or over email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all your future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations remastered and sounding awesome every Tuesday at noon, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Joel for President 2924.